I booked the Airbnb because I needed a quiet place to finish a report for work. It was early March 2020, right before the lockdown started, and I was desperate to get away from the constant background noise of the city. The listing was for a small house on the outskirts of a rural town, a 2-hour drive from my apartment. The pictures were simple but appealing. Pale wood floors, high ceilings, a fireplace, and large windows overlooking a sparse forest. I liked the idea of being alone with only my thoughts and the sound of wind in the trees. The drive there was uneventful, mostly highway with occasional stretches of farmland. By the time I turned onto the gravel road leading to the house, the sky had shifted to a pale gray, and the wind carried a faint smell of wet earth. The road was narrow, bordered by tall, thin trees, and the further I drove, the quieter it became. I parked in front of the house, noticing immediately how isolated it was. There were no other houses in sight, not even a mailbox or a sign. The structure itself was simple, 2 stories with a small porch and a narrow driveway that ended abruptly at the forest line. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The floors were cold beneath my feet, and the sunlight coming through the windows highlighted the neatness of the space. Everything was in order. Towels folded on the bed, kitchen counters clear, the fireplace unused but tidy. The house was warmer than I expected, and I took a few minutes to explore. The living area had a sofa, a single armchair, and a small dining table. The kitchen was compact but functional. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms, both sparsely furnished, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. That first evening, I made a simple dinner, then set up my laptop at the dining table. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and I felt a slight unease. It wasn't fear, just the awareness that I was alone in a house that was meant to be lived in by someone else. I tried to focus on my work, but every time the wind shifted, I caught the faintest creak from the floorboards above, like someone walking. I reminded myself it was an old house. Old houses make noises. That thought helped, but only a little. Around 9, I decided to take a break and sit by the window, watching the trees bend and sway. The forest was darkening faster than I expected, the shadows pooling around the base of the trees. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A shape between the trees, tall and still. I froze, waiting for it to move again, but it didn't. After a minute, I realized it was probably just a tree, the way the branches intertwined and caught the fading light. I laughed at myself, feeling foolish, and went back to my work. Sleep came slowly. The wind had grown stronger, and I could hear branches scratching against the sides of the house. Every time the house groaned, I flinched, imagining someone outside. I kept checking the windows, convinced I'd see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a low, rhythmic sound coming from the porch. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then I realized it sounded like footsteps on the wooden boards. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting each step as it came closer and then receded. It didn't last long, maybe a minute, but it was enough to make my stomach knot. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the porch. There were no footprints, no marks in the gravel. The boards were dry and undisturbed. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something heavier like a deer stepping onto the porch. It was plausible. I tried to convince myself of that as I poured coffee and ate breakfast. Throughout the day, I kept noticing small things that unsettled me. A chair slightly out of place, a window that seemed fogged from the inside, and the feeling that someone had been in the kitchen. Nothing concrete, nothing I could prove, just subtle disturbances that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I spent most of the day outside, walking around the property, trying to clear my mind. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There were no birds, no rustling, just the wind through the bare branches. That night, I decided to leave the porch light on. I sat in the living room, laptop closed, listening to the wind. At around 11, I thought I heard the door to the upstairs bedroom click shut. I froze, straining my ears. The house was silent except for the wind. I checked the bedroom. The door was closed, but I was the only one there. I felt my chest tighten and a cold wave of anxiety wash over me. I went through the house, checking every lock, every window, every entrance. Everything was secure. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed in the living room, lights on, listening. Every noise was magnified. The wind against the windows, the floorboards settling, the faint rustle of leaves outside. I imagined someone watching, waiting for the right moment to move. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved to see sunlight filtering through the windows. I made coffee and packed my things. On the drive home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. There was nothing illegal, nothing actually threatening. Just a combination of isolation, old wood, and my own mind amplifying every minor noise. Still, the experience lingered with me. It was the kind of fear that isn't dramatic or violent but insidious, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. When I got back to my apartment, I realized I hadn't checked the reviews closely before booking. A few mentioned odd noises at night and feeling watched, but I hadn't taken them seriously. I realized now that the house was fine. It was just the isolation that played on your mind. The ending was simple. The house was secure, I was safe, and I had no actual threat, but the memory of those nights stayed with me for months. I avoided rural Airbnbs after that, sticking to places with neighbors, lights, and the reassurance of other people nearby. The fear wasn't in the house itself, it was in being alone in a place where the normal rules of city life didn't apply, and that lesson stayed with me far longer than any actual danger could have. The experience taught me to respect solitude, to understand how much your mind can fill in the blanks, and to plan more carefully when seeking isolation. It wasn't terrifying in a dramatic sense, but it was deeply unsettling in a way that made me feel vulnerable and alert for the first time in years. By the time I returned to my normal routine, I understood that fear doesn't need a tangible source. It only needs a gap between expectation and reality, a space where the mind can wander, and the isolation of that house created exactly that. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, needing a quiet weekend away from the city. It was late September, the kind of early fall where the air starts to smell crisp and damp, but the trees still hold their color. The listing was for a small cabin just outside a town I had barely heard of. The photos made it look charming. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, a small porch with 2 chairs facing the woods. I told myself I wanted solitude, the kind you can't get in an apartment, and this place promised exactly that. The drive took longer than I expected, winding through narrow roads with trees arching overhead. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, spilling orange across the tops of the pines. The cabin sat back from the road, and there was no visible neighbor. I parked, unloaded my bag, and took a slow walk around the property. It was quiet except for the distant hum of a highway I couldn't see. The porch creaked under my weight. The door opened easily. The place smelled faintly of wood polish and something sweet, like candles. Inside, it was smaller than the pictures suggested. The main room had a sofa, a table, and a small kitchen area. The bedroom was off to the side, with a bed facing a window that overlooked the edge of the forest. Everything was neatly arranged, but there were small signs that someone had been there recently. A half-used roll of toilet paper, a coffee mug in the sink, a few crumbs on the counter. I assumed it was just the cleaning service being sloppy. I unpacked slowly, setting my things on the bed and wandering through the cabin. The electricity worked fine. The Wi-Fi was weak but usable. Outside, the forest pressed close to the windows, darkening the corners of the room even in the late afternoon light. I brewed coffee and sat on the porch for a while, watching the shadows stretch and the wind rustle the leaves. It felt peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that settles over you and makes your own heartbeat loud. By evening, the isolation started to feel heavier. The sun disappeared entirely, and the forest around the cabin became a dark wall. I lit a lamp, settled into the sofa, and tried to read, but the sounds outside made it hard to focus. Twigs snapped too sharply underfoot. Leaves rustled in places I knew I hadn't stepped. I told myself it was animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. The thought of people being nearby crossed my mind briefly, but the nearest road was far enough that it seemed unlikely anyone would be wandering here. Around 9, I went to the bedroom to get ready for bed. The air was colder than I expected. I closed the window, drew the curtains, and climbed into the bed. That's when I heard the first clear sound. A soft tap on the window. I froze, straining to hear. The forest was still, the only sound my own breathing. Another tap, slightly louder, and closer to the side of the cabin. My heart sped. I told myself it was a branch, a bird hitting the glass, anything but what it felt like. Someone outside, deliberately making noise. I got out of bed and turned on the porch light. The yard was empty, nothing moving. I walked around, checking the perimeter, peering into the woods. Everything looked normal. The air had a slight chill, and I could see my breath. The porch steps creaked under my weight. I went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise, the settling of the cabin, the scrape of a chair in the living room, the tap of a branch against the window, felt like it had intent behind it. I eventually dozed, but only lightly, waking at irregular intervals, each time hearing a sound that made my stomach knot. At one point, I woke to the unmistakable sound of the front door opening, a soft creak of hinges. I shot upright, my body tense, scanning the room. Nothing. The door was closed. I checked the locks. Locked. Morning brought relief. Sunlight poured into the cabin, warming the wooden floors and dissolving the heaviness of the night. I convinced myself it had been the wind, perhaps an animal on the porch, or my imagination magnifying every sound. I stayed inside most of the day, unpacked some snacks, read a book, and tried to let the morning calm settle me. That night, however, the unease returned. The tap on the window came again, slower, deliberate. I didn't move this time, just listened. Then I heard a sound I couldn't ignore. Footsteps on the porch, moving toward the back door. The cabin's layout meant someone walking around outside could be entirely unseen from inside, and my stomach sank. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the host or the police, but the signal was almost non-existent. I texted, no reply. The footsteps stopped, then moved back toward the front. Then silence. I stayed awake all night, clutching a heavy flashlight, checking every sound. When the sun finally came, I got dressed, packed quickly, and left without looking back. The drive home was tense, every shadow on the side of the road making me flinch. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I could finally breathe. Later, I contacted the Airbnb host to report what happened. They seemed surprised and apologized, saying no one should have been on the property and that they'd inspect the cabin. I never got a detailed explanation, but they refunded my stay. I never returned to that area. Looking back, I understand what made it so terrifying wasn't just the potential of someone being outside. It was the total isolation combined with the subtle, constant indicators that the cabin was not as empty as it appeared. Every small sound, every shadow, became a message I couldn't ignore. It was a reminder that even a peaceful place, carefully chosen for solitude, can become unsafe in the wrong circumstances. I've stayed in other Airbnbs since, but I avoid cabins in remote areas now. The memory of that place lingers, the way the night felt alive around me, not with animals or wind, but with the possibility of someone watching, someone moving silently just outside the walls. That cabin taught me that safety in isolation is fragile, and that even a place meant to be restful can turn into something oppressive when the normal rules of distance and privacy are broken. I booked the Airbnb because I wanted a break from the city, a place where I could escape deadlines, noise, and the constant sense of being watched by screens and traffic. It was late August 2019, and the listing described a small cabin on a private lake, somewhere in northern Michigan. The reviews were sparse but enthusiastic, highlighting quiet mornings, a clean interior, and access to a dock that extended into the water. I went with a friend who needed the same kind of solitude, and we arrived in the late afternoon after a 6-hour drive through stretches of farmland, pines, and winding roads barely wide enough for 2 cars. The approach to the property was narrow, gravel, and flanked by tall trees whose branches formed an arch overhead. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting mottled shadows on the ground. The house itself was modest. Wooden siding that had been recently painted, a small porch with a rocking chair, and a single window reflecting the late afternoon light. The lake was immediately behind it, a calm sheet of water that seemed perfectly still. It was wide, but not large enough to be intimidating, bordered by reeds and trees. The water had a clarity that made the bottom visible near the shore, shallow and pebbly, and yet, when we moved closer, I noticed something strange. Our reflections weren't there. The water mirrored everything else, the trees, the sky, but not us. I pointed it out to my friend, and they blinked and looked again. Nothing. The reflection was incomplete. Our forms, our shadows were absent. We brushed it off. The sun was at an odd angle, the water surface slightly rippled, or maybe it was the way the cabin cast shadows. The host had mentioned the light could create strange effects late in the afternoon. We unpacked, arranged our things, and settled in. The cabin was simple, clean, and quiet, with a faint smell of wood polish and pine. There was a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living area that opened onto the porch facing the lake. I spent some time standing on the dock, feet near the edge, staring at the water. The lack of reflection didn't feel threatening at first, just unusual, like a photographic error in real life. The sun set slowly, the sky fading into purples and oranges, and the lake became a dark sheet. Night fell fast once it reached the horizon. That first evening was still and silent except for occasional rustling from the trees and the distant hum of cicadas. At some point, I noticed movement along the shoreline, a thin, dark shape that moved just at the water's edge. It didn't make waves, didn't splash. The water rippled only slightly where it passed, enough to make the reflection of the trees wobble, but nothing else. It was taller than any human I could imagine walking in the water at that distance. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that shadows stretch and bend near dark water, that maybe the slope of the shore and the angle of the moon were playing with perception. Later, while leaning on the railing of the dock, I felt the boards shift under weight, subtle, deliberate. I froze, scanning the dark lake. There was no one, no sound other than the soft creak of the wood beneath me. The dock swayed slightly, though I hadn't moved. I leaned forward, bracing myself, expecting to see a friend from the cabin, an animal, maybe even a branch falling from a tree, but nothing appeared. The water was still except for that faint disturbance near the far edge, as if something had brushed through it without touching it. I stepped back, and the boards stopped creaking. Sleep didn't come easily. The sounds of the cabin were amplified, the gentle wind through the trees, the settling of the wooden walls, the occasional crack of a branch hitting water. I imagined a person walking along the shoreline, just beyond visibility, careful, deliberate, and silent. I convinced myself it was impossible. The nearest road was half a mile away. No one could reach us without making noise. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a sensation that had nothing to do with the actual presence of another human. Morning brought sunlight, and with it a clarity that was almost surreal. The lake, once dark and reflective only of the trees and sky, now mirrored everything, including us. Standing on the dock, I saw myself clearly, my friend beside me, our postures, our clothes, every movement perfectly captured. The phenomenon had reversed with the light. I felt a strange relief, but also an unease that was harder to articulate. When the host arrived to check in, they smiled and said it was just a trick of the light, a natural phenomenon caused by angles, depth, and the clarity of the water. They seemed unbothered, casual, almost amused by the fact that it unsettled people. We didn't swim that morning. We didn't swim the entire weekend. The lake had the surface of a mirror in some moments, and a void in others, and neither of us trusted it. We spent the day hiking the small trails behind the cabin, keeping our distance from the shore, speaking little. The stillness of the forest, combined with the lake's changing reflection, had created a tension that no conversation could dispel. Every glance at the water carried a hesitation, every step near the dock a careful calculation. By the second night, we understood the rhythm of the lake. Afternoon and morning light revealed our reflections, and at dusk, they disappeared. And each night, That thin, indistinct movement returned at the water's edge. It was never close, never loud, but enough to keep us alert. I noticed small details I hadn't the first night. The way reeds bent without wind, subtle ripples forming without splashes, and the faint creak of the dock under non-existent weight. It was all explainable, all mundane, yet unnerving in its consistency. When we left on Sunday, the feeling of being observed lingered. The drive back to the highway passed in tense silence, both of us staring at the trees, half expecting to see someone walking along the lake behind us. Back in the city, I tried to process it logically. Light reflection, optical illusions, tension heightened by isolation. The lake had no danger, no intruder, just conditions that played tricks on perception and imagination. The host's explanation was plausible, and yet the experience left a mark. I realized that fear doesn't need an actual threat. It only requires something that doesn't fit our understanding of the world. A perfectly still lake that ignores your presence, a dock that creaks under invisible weight, and the unexplainable behavior of water in familiar surroundings. The Airbnb itself was normal, secure, and entirely safe. Nothing illegal, nothing deliberately malicious occurred. And yet, the subtle, persistent irregularity of the lake, the absence of reflection, the movement along the shoreline, was enough to create unease. The weekend left me aware of how much the mind searches for patterns, how quickly it interprets inconsistencies as threats. The clarity of morning, when the reflections returned, confirmed there was nothing to fear, yet the memory of those nights stayed with me. I haven't returned to that lake. I still think about it sometimes when I see water, especially calm water, and the way it can hide what is or isn't there. The experience was not supernatural, not violent, but it was precise and disorienting in a way that reality rarely allows. And for a moment, it was enough to make me question what I could trust in my own senses. A reminder that even the simplest, most ordinary settings can become profoundly unsettling when subtle inconsistencies persist. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and in a quiet area, somewhere on the outskirts of a small town I needed to pass through for work. The pictures looked normal. A modest house with a small lawn, a few outdoor chairs, and a shed tucked to the side. The host's instructions were unusually strict from the start. There was a long list of rules. No shoes inside, no entering the shed, certain cabinets were off limits, and the freezer in the kitchen was locked with a padlock. At first, I assumed it was just someone being cautious or eccentric. The tone of the messages was polite but insistent, almost defensive. I shrugged it off. I've stayed in strange Airbnbs before. When I arrived, the house looked like the photos, but there was a strange heaviness to it. The air inside smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals mixed with something sharp, metallic, a smell I couldn't immediately place. The floors were polished, everything arranged carefully, but there was an odd tension in the space, like someone had spent time rehearsing exactly how it should look. I unpacked my things slowly, noting small things that didn't make sense. The curtain rods were set so tightly against the windows that the curtains barely moved. The kitchen utensils were lined up perfectly. The fridge was half-stocked with items that all seemed unnaturally neat. The rules weren't just printed. They were emphasized multiple times in notes left on the counter. I tried to ignore them. I figured the locked freezer was likely just the host keeping personal food safe, and the cabinets off-limits probably held cleaning supplies. Still, there was a nagging curiosity. After a long drive, I made dinner and cleaned up carefully, avoiding anything that might have violated the rules. The quiet of the house was comforting at first, but as the evening wore on, the silence became oppressive. The ticking of the kitchen clock sounded louder than it should have. Every creak in the floorboards drew my attention. It was past midnight when I wandered into the kitchen for water. My gaze landed on the freezer again. The padlock had a faint rust color, and the door itself was scuffed, old. I knew I shouldn't, but my curiosity got the better of me. The padlock clicked open easier than expected, almost like it hadn't been fully secured. I pulled the door open slowly. The smell hit first. Sharp, coppery, metallic, sour. My stomach dropped, and I gagged, taking a step back. Inside, the freezer looked clean. The shelves were bare, frosted over in places, but the interior walls were streaked with dark stains. They weren't accidental marks. They had depth, like they had been scratched into the metal. I leaned closer and saw the scratches were uneven, deep enough to be made by fingernails, jagged and frantic. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I closed the freezer door. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant had a pet that scratched inside. I told myself. Maybe someone had spilled something years ago. But the depth and irregularity of the scratches told a different story, and the smell lingered, impossible to ignore. My stomach churned, and I suddenly felt exposed in the empty house. I spent the rest of the night unable to sleep, every small noise outside making me tense, every creak inside the floorboards making me jump. Morning brought little relief. I considered leaving immediately, but I had obligations in the area. I walked the perimeter of the house, hoping to calm my nerves, but even the yard felt too tidy, too controlled. The shed sat at the edge of the lawn, a small building locked with a chain. Its windows were dark, opaque, like it had been scrubbed clean from the inside. I resisted looking too closely, telling myself some things were better left alone. Later in the afternoon, I stepped out for a short drive to get supplies. I returned to the house to find the door unlocked. That wasn't unusual. I might have forgotten to lock it, but inside, I noticed something unsettling. A small envelope on the counter, plain, no markings. I didn't open it. The air inside felt heavier than before. Evening fell, and the sky outside darkened quickly. I was in the living room, attempting to read, but every shadow felt off. Then I heard it. A soft knock, polite but firm, at the front door. I froze. The host hadn't mentioned visiting that evening. The notes explicitly warned not to disturb him except at agreed times. I stayed still, hoping it was someone else, maybe a neighbor, but the knock came again, followed by the sound of a key in the door. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my keys, my phone, my bag, and slipped out the side door before anyone could enter. I ran to my car, heart hammering, hands shaking. Once inside, I started the engine and drove without stopping, not even glancing back. The house disappeared behind the trees as I sped away, but the memory of the smell, the scratches in the freezer, and the oppressive stillness stayed with me. I didn't report it to Airbnb immediately. I needed distance to think, to process what I had seen. When I finally sent a message describing my experience, the host replied with calm apologies, claiming there had been a freezer malfunction and accidents in the past that required some restrictions. The vague explanation only confirmed my unease. Looking back, I realized the warning signs had been there from the beginning. The excessive rules, the locked spaces, the strange insistence on privacy. The house had been curated to feel normal, to keep visitors from looking too closely. I hadn't expected danger from a simple Airbnb, but the scratches and the smell made it clear that something in that house had been hidden for a reason. I never stayed in a private rental in that town again. The experience left me cautious, almost hyper-aware of small details in places that seem ordinary. Even now, the memory of opening that freezer lingers vividly, the shock of seeing those scratches, the smell that burned into my memory. It's not a story I tell often, because it doesn't have a dramatic climax, no confrontation, no one caught in the act. The horror was in the stillness, the control, the tiny details that suggested something deeply wrong had happened there. Leaving before the host arrived was the only decision I could make, the only way to preserve a sense of safety in a situation that had made the ordinary feel threatening. I still drive past that area occasionally, careful not to linger, careful not to look at houses that seem too clean, too orderly. The memory is a warning, simple and clear. Sometimes, the things you aren't allowed to touch are the things that reveal the darkest truths. I arrived at the apartment in the late afternoon after a long day of travel. The building was an older structure tucked into a narrow street, with faded brick and a small, neglected courtyard. The entrance smelled faintly of mildew, but the lobby was clean enough, and the elevator worked without complaint. I had chosen the unit because it was cheap and centrally located, and I figured a modest apartment in a rundown building was preferable to paying more elsewhere for something generic. The key worked on the first turn, and I stepped into the unit. At first glance, it looked normal. The living room had a small sofa, a coffee table with a few magazines, and a window that let in just enough light to make the space feel open. The kitchen was compact but functional, with a fridge, stove, and cabinets that seemed to contain basic necessities left by previous guests. The apartment smelled faintly of cleaning products and air freshener, a chemical sharpness that I usually associated with professional turnover. Everything seemed orderly, almost too orderly, but I brushed the feeling aside. I began to unpack, putting my suitcase on the bed in the bedroom at the far end of the hall. I had taken only a few steps when I noticed the closet. The door was slightly ajar, but what caught my attention was the angle. It didn't swing open naturally. The door appeared to be blocked from the inside. At first, I thought maybe the hinge was warped or the frame had shifted, but the space was small and I had a clear view. The door was jammed, pushed outward ever so slightly. I froze for a moment, the kind of pause that comes from sensing something isn't right without being able to immediately articulate why. Then I heard it, breathing, slow, deliberate, calm. It came from the closet, a rhythm that suggested someone was sitting or crouching just out of sight. My first instinct was disbelief. There was no way someone could be inside. The host had explicitly stated the apartment was empty before my arrival. I stepped back cautiously, trying to steady my heart. The sound continued, methodical and unhurried, rising and falling in a way that matched no appliance or vent in the room. My stomach knotted as I realized it wasn't mechanical. Someone was in there. I backed into the living room and immediately called the host. When they answered, I explained the situation, careful not to panic in my voice. There was a long silence on the line before the host insisted the unit was empty and accused me of lying. The calmness in their response only heightened my anxiety. Their denial was absolute. They repeated that no one else was in the apartment, that the space had been cleaned and secured. My unease deepened, and I realized that continuing to argue or try to reason would accomplish nothing. I couldn't stay. I moved quickly but cautiously, grabbing my essentials and making sure to keep the closet in my peripheral vision. The breathing had stopped by then, but the door remained blocked, a silent warning that whatever was inside wasn't going to make itself known unless I provoked it. I left the apartment without looking back, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I walked down the stairwell and out into the street. The evening air was cool and smelled faintly of damp asphalt. I kept walking, not taking a cab or rideshare, just moving until the apartment building was well behind me. I found a small hotel not far away and checked in immediately, unable to shake the tension that had settled in my chest. Even in the safety of my new room, I felt exposed, alert, like I could hear movement through walls where there was none. My mind ran through every possibility. Maybe the host was lying. Maybe someone had snuck in after the cleaning. Maybe the apartment had never been properly secured. Nothing explained the slow, steady breathing I had heard or the way the closet door had been jammed. That night, I checked the Airbnb listing from my phone. The unit was still available. The calendar open for new guests. Pictures looked the same, the description unchanged. I realized that, at some point, someone else could easily check in, unaware of what I had experienced. I couldn't confirm whether the person I had sensed was still inside, or if it had been someone who had left before I arrived. The uncertainty gnawed at me. Sleep was impossible. Every small noise from the street below, every creak of the building, made my heart race. I kept picturing the closet door, imagining what might have been lurking just out of view. I reviewed the layout of the apartment in my mind, noting how small the space was, how easily someone could hide and remain unnoticed. The thought that the host might be complicit, that they might know something I didn't, made my skin crawl. By morning, I had made a decision. I reported the incident to Airbnb, detailing everything as carefully as I could. I included my timeline, the breathing, the blocked door, and the host's denial. I requested an immediate review and removal of the listing, but within hours, I could still see the unit available online. The platform had taken no immediate action. The memory stayed with me long after I returned home. I avoided that neighborhood entirely, and I became obsessive about checking locks, ensuring doors were secure, and paying attention to small details whenever I booked a rental. The incident changed how I approached travel. I could no longer assume that an empty apartment was truly empty, that the host's assurances were reliable, or that the pictures told the full story. Thinking back, the most disturbing part wasn't the fear of what was in the closet. It was the calmness of the breathing, the way it suggested the presence of someone fully aware of me, waiting, unafraid. That quiet, methodical rhythm stayed with me, the sound echoing in my mind in moments of silence. The apartment looked normal, just like the listing, just like countless rentals I had stayed in before, but the normalcy was a mask. Behind it was something unaccounted for, something real and patient and unnoticed. I never stayed in another Airbnb in that city. I never saw that host's listing removed. The memory remains precise. The angle of the closet door, the slow breathing, the disbelief in the host's voice, the oppressive sense of being watched. I will never forget how ordinary the apartment seemed, how completely normal everything appeared until I noticed the details that proved otherwise. The experience was a reminder that safety is often assumed rather than guaranteed, and that sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. It waits quietly behind doors you aren't supposed to open. I booked a small cabin through Airbnb on the outskirts of a rural town in upstate New York. It was late October, and I wanted to get away from the city for a few days, thinking the quiet and isolation would help me reset. The cabin's listing was sparse but promising. A single-story wooden structure, surrounded by tall oaks and maples, far enough from the main road that I could expect silence at night. The photos showed a neat interior, hardwood floors, and a wood-burning stove. The price was reasonable, so I booked it without overthinking. The drive there was long and increasingly lonely. I followed narrow, winding roads that became thinner as I approached the coordinates listed in the Airbnb app. My GPS warned that I might lose signal, and eventually I did. I drove over a mile on dirt roads, the trees forming dark walls on either side. I noticed the branches were heavier than usual, almost pressing in on the road, and the late afternoon sun was quickly disappearing behind them. I kept telling myself it was just the time of year and the angle of the sun. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of distant traffic from the main road that seemed miles away. The cabin looked just like the photos, though the wood siding had a muted, weathered gray that suggested years of neglect. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped out of the car, and I realized there was no mailbox, no signs of neighbors, no lights anywhere. I unlocked the door, which had a keypad entry, and stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood polish and something else. Damp, musty, like old fabric. The living room was tidy, with a small sofa, a coffee table, and a stack of firewood neatly arranged beside the stove. The kitchen was basic but clean, with plates, utensils, and a small refrigerator. The bedroom was minimal. A queen bed, a dresser, and a small window overlooking the forest. The bathroom was compact but functional. I set down my bag and walked through the cabin, opening windows to let in air and checking all the locks. Everything seemed normal, though the air felt slightly cooler than it should have, and I noticed the floorboards creaked under even the lightest step, sounding sharper than in a normal house. I made a fire in the stove and prepared a simple dinner. Outside, darkness fell quickly, and the shadows of trees pressed against the windows. At first, the quiet was soothing, almost meditative. But as the night deepened, I noticed small, strange things. The first was subtle. A faint scuffing sound on the porch, almost like someone dragging a shoe. I told myself it was the wind or a branch brushing against the boards. Then I heard it again, softer, almost deliberate. I looked out the window, the firelight illuminating the porch, but saw nothing. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every few minutes the sound returned, sometimes from the porch, sometimes from the back of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore once I noticed it. I checked the doors and windows. All were locked. The feeling of being watched settled over me. The isolation, which had seemed peaceful, now felt oppressive. I didn't want to imagine someone could be lurking nearby, but my instincts screamed at me that something was off. Around midnight, the noises changed. Instead of scuffing, I started hearing low, muffled thumps, like someone walking very carefully on the ground outside, careful not to step on leaves or branches. I froze each time I heard it, straining to listen, my heart pounding. It moved slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, stopping for long moments before continuing. I didn't dare open the door. My phone had no signal, so calling anyone was impossible. The idea of a neighbor didn't exist. I knew I was alone for miles. I sat on the sofa, trying to calm myself, keeping the fire going, and watching the shadows outside. The thumping returned, closer now, as if it had circled to the side of the cabin. The sound was methodical, deliberate, and I realized that whatever was outside was familiar with the cabin's layout. I could almost pinpoint each step in the dark. The rational part of me insisted it could be an animal, a raccoon, a stray dog, but the pattern was too precise, too deliberate. The sound paused under the window, then moved away again, slow and quiet. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake until dawn, occasionally peeking out, always expecting to see movement. When the first light crept through the trees, the forest seemed innocuous again, peaceful almost, and the previous night felt surreal. I waited until the sun fully rose and decided to inspect the perimeter. What I found made my stomach drop. The ground around the cabin was marked with depressions, shallow but wide, like something had crouched and moved deliberately across the yard. The leaves hadn't been disturbed naturally. They were pressed down, flattened as if someone or something had carefully moved across the ground. They stopped abruptly at the porch, at the exact line where my firewood stack and steps began. Nothing else seemed missing, but the precision, the careful pattern told me whoever or whatever had been outside knew exactly how to approach without leaving obvious tracks. I packed quickly and left without breakfast. The drive back on the dirt road felt like it took hours, the forest silent and unchanging. I never contacted the host, never returned, and the Airbnb listing disappeared months later, taken offline. Even now, when I think about it, the precise movements, the silence, and the way whatever was outside avoided leaving obvious evidence still unnerves me. The horror wasn't the idea of a ghost or monster, but the knowledge that someone or something was carefully observing me, moving just out of sight, in a way that felt intimate and invasive. The experience left me distrustful of isolation, and I've avoided rural Airbnb rentals ever since. I booked the house because I was moving across states and needed a stop before continuing my drive north. Hotels along the route were either full or overpriced, and this Airbnb appeared cheap, isolated, and quiet. The listing described an adobe structure on the outskirts of a reservation, far from any town. The photos showed low walls, thick wooden beams, and a small courtyard that opened onto desert scrub. It looked old but well kept. I arrived in late afternoon, the sun low and red behind the mesas, long shadows stretching across the dirt road. The air was dry, with that sharp desert smell of dust and sage, and the quiet was heavy in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The house was unlocked when I arrived. The instructions left under the doormat were simple. Inside, it smelled faintly of sun-baked clay and old wood. The floors were uneven, adobe walls thick, cooling the air even in June heat. The furniture was sparse, mostly a couch, a low table, and a small kitchenette. A ceiling fan hung over the main room, moving slowly. There were 2 bedrooms, each with a low bed and a single dresser. I set my bag down in the room closest to the kitchen, opened the windows to let in a faint breeze, and made myself a simple dinner. On the kitchen counter sat a guest book. I flipped through it out of boredom. The pages were filled with notes from past guests, scribbled in a mixture of faded ink and pencil. Some mentioned trips to the nearby reservation, others simply remarked on the quiet or the view of the desert. Most entries were dated months or years earlier. I continued through the pages, skimming the names. Near the end, 3 pages from the back, I froze. Written in fresh ink, a name appeared. My full name, spelled correctly. The date was 2 days before my booking. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. My stomach tightened. I assumed it was some odd coincidence at first, but my pulse quickened as I read the entry. It described my day almost exactly. The stops I had made earlier in the drive, the gas station where I had filled the tank, the small store where I bought jerky, the route I had taken after sunset. Every detail matched, as if someone had been following me, noting exactly what I did. I checked my phone, my email, even the Airbnb messages, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the host had written it mistakenly, perhaps someone else with the same name had stayed before, and the timing was a coincidence. But the details were specific, not generic travel notes. Every stop, every small decision was accounted for. My hands shook slightly as I closed the book and set it back on the counter. I tried to focus on other things. I unpacked some clothes, filled my water bottle, and sat on the porch for a few minutes, looking out at the desert. The sun sank behind the hills, the sky turning a deep orange. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the sand. I told myself to relax, that I was alone and safe, but the feeling of being watched did not dissipate. I went to bed early, leaving the windows slightly open. The desert air was cooler at night, and the silence pressed against the walls. Somewhere far off, an occasional coyote yipped. In the darkness, I felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the space behind the walls had changed. I tried to sleep, my eyes closed. Around midnight, I woke with the sense that someone was outside. Not a sound, not a knock, but a pressure in the air, subtle and deliberate. I opened my eyes and turned toward the window. There, just beyond the glass, a tall figure stood. It did not move. It did not touch the window or make a sound. Its outline blocked the moonlight, stark against the faint silver glow. I could not make out features, only the shape and the stillness. I froze, heartbeat loud in my ears. My body wanted to move, to scream, to call someone, but my mind locked in disbelief. The figure did not shift, sway, or attempt entry. It simply stayed, waiting, watching from the shadows beyond the pane. I blinked several times, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a branch casting a shadow, but the shape remained consistent, solid. Time crawled. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. My eyes never left the silhouette. I did not move. I could hear my own breathing. The desert was quiet, the wind absent. Nothing stirred but that presence. The moonlight shifted slightly as clouds passed, casting the figure into a softer outline, then sharp again. I could sense the stillness, the patience, the observation. I did not sleep again. When the first hint of light came, a pale gray spreading across the sky, the figure had disappeared. I waited another half hour before moving, checking the porch and the yard. Nothing was there. No footprints, no disturbed dirt, no tire tracks. Only the desert, still and empty. I packed quickly, my movements deliberate and silent. I did not eat, did not drink, barely touched my bag. Every sound outside made me flinch. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and shut the door behind me. I did not look back. I did not check the rearview mirror as I drove down the gravel road, leaving the house and the desert behind. The rest of the trip passed in a blur. My eyes remained glued to the road, over every shoulder, scanning for movement I did not expect to see. I told myself repeatedly that I was imagining things, that the guest book and the figure were coincidences or tricks of light, but the memory remained, sharp and insistent. Looking back, the oddest part is the precision. Someone had known exactly where I was, exactly what I had done that day, and had been able to write it before I even arrived. And then, later, there had been that figure. I cannot explain it. I do not know if the host was involved, or if it was someone else entirely. I only know that I was alone in a house that was supposed to be safe, and yet nothing about it felt private. I have not returned to that area since. I avoid the edges of reservations when traveling alone, and I never stay in small, isolated Airbnbs without careful review of the host and their reputation. The adobe house in northern Arizona, the guest book, the figure at the window, all remain clear in my mind, detailed and unyielding. The desert seems quiet from a distance, beautiful and still, but I remember it differently. As a place where someone knew me before I arrived, where I was observed without warning, and where the isolation that once seemed peaceful became profoundly threatening. I booked the studio because it was small, modern, and had a view of the ocean. The listing emphasized the balcony and floor-to-ceiling windows. I had planned a few days away to work on some writing and decompress. Hotels were expensive and impersonal, and this place seemed quiet, private, and more personal. The host mentioned a single exterior security camera for insurance purposes. I didn't think much of it. The camera was mounted near the entrance, facing the street and the small patio below the balcony. I assumed it recorded the front area for deliveries or safety, nothing more. When I arrived in the late afternoon, the building felt nearly empty. The small parking area held only a few cars. The studio itself was clean and sleek, white walls, polished wood floors, a compact kitchen, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The balcony offered a wide view of the ocean. The sound of waves was constant, low and soothing, but also masking anything subtle. The studio smelled faintly of salt and bleach, nothing unpleasant. I unpacked and set my laptop on the kitchen counter. The Wi-Fi was fast, the password provided in the listing instructions. The first day passed quietly. I sat on the balcony, worked for a few hours, took a walk along the path near the cliff, and returned to cook a simple dinner. Everything was normal. The camera was visible from the balcony, facing outward toward the driveway. I checked it briefly, thinking about privacy, and dismissed it. That night, I noticed the first unusual thing. Around 10:15 p.m., I stepped outside onto the balcony to photograph the sunset fading over the horizon. Almost immediately, I received a message from the host. The message was casual, asking if I was okay, and commenting on the view. I didn't think much of it at first. A few minutes later, I returned inside, and another message came. This time, it referenced the movement on the balcony. I checked the camera location in my mind. It could not possibly capture the living area or the door leading to the bedroom. I shrugged it off, assuming the host was simply monitoring the security system remotely. Later that evening, I closed the blinds in the bedroom before sleeping. A soft ping on my phone woke me up. Another message from the host, this time asking why I had closed the blinds. I found it unusual but not alarming. I was tired and ignored it. The second day, the pattern became more pronounced. Every time I stepped onto the balcony, every time I returned, every time I moved in the studio, a message arrived within seconds. They were not greetings or check-ins. They were precise observations. Noticing when I opened the blinds, when I stepped toward the kitchenette, when I switched on the small floor lamp in the corner. The speed and specificity made me uneasy. Something about it did not feel right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the host had connected a smart home system, tracking lights and motion through the router. That was possible, but it was precise, almost unnervingly so. I began to feel watched, not by cameras, but by someone who could track my movements almost in real time. That night, around 11:42 p.m., I was brushing my teeth when my phone buzzed. Another message. This time, it referenced the bathroom light, asking why I had turned it on again. I froze. The camera did not face the bathroom window. It was impossible for the host to have seen me from the outside. I double-checked the camera's position from the balcony. There was no angle that could capture the bathroom. I turned off the light, left the bathroom door closed, and sat on the bed trying to calm myself. The feeling of being watched escalated quickly. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the building settling, the distant crash of waves. The balcony door rattled slightly in the wind. My phone buzzed intermittently, notifications from the host continuing at odd intervals. I realized the host must be actively monitoring my activity in ways beyond the camera, perhaps using the Wi-Fi network or a connected smart system. I could not sleep. The studio felt smaller, the walls closer. I debated leaving, but I was too tired to pack in the middle of the night. Around 1:30 a.m., I finally made a decision. I unplugged the Wi-Fi router from the wall. Immediately, my phone lit up. 6 messages arrived over the next few hours, each timestamped before sunrise. The host was asking why the signal went offline, noting the time it happened. No threats, no accusations, just observations that made it clear they were following every movement. I left the studio before dawn. I packed quickly in near darkness, leaving the apartment exactly as I had found it, but unable to shake the feeling that someone had been inside, monitoring me in ways I could not see. Outside, the ocean smelled sharp and fresh. The air carried the normal morning sounds of birds and distant traffic, but I did not pause to watch the sunrise. I drove immediately to a motel several miles away. The rooms were cheaper than the Airbnb for the night, quieter in a way that felt safe, even if less scenic. I later checked the listing. The camera was still visible in the photos, but there was no mention of any smart home monitoring. The host had disabled the calendar and removed all reviews. The messages I had received were still visible on my phone. I saved them. Every timestamp matched perfectly, showing how quickly the host was monitoring me. Over the next few days, I researched home monitoring systems, smart cameras, and how external observers could track devices through Wi-Fi networks. Everything I read confirmed what I had feared. The host could have been using connected devices to monitor activity inside the studio in real time, well beyond the angle of the camera. It was legal in some jurisdictions to have exterior cameras for insurance, but tracking internal movements without disclosure crossed a line. I realized then that the entire experience, the messages, the precise timing, the observation of lights and blinds, had nothing supernatural or fantastical about it. It was simple, deliberate, and controlled. Someone had access to information about my movements and chose to exploit it, not through force, but through technology and proximity. The fear came from understanding that someone could see you without being visible, know where you were, and act as if they were inside your personal space without ever stepping over the threshold. I have not returned to that area since. I do not use Airbnb for solo trips anymore, especially for places with remote hosts and active monitoring. I stick to hotels now, places where staff can intervene and where there are walls I know are not under someone else's surveillance. The ocean view of that studio still appears in my memory. It looks calm, beautiful, safe from a distance, but I know what lurked behind it. Control disguised as security, the realization that someone could track you with nothing more than a network and a few devices. The fear was quiet, precise, and persistent, and that memory has not faded. We booked the house because every hotel within driving distance had doubled its price for the weekend. There was a concert, a sports event, something like that. The Airbnb was cheaper, clean in the photos, and located in a quiet neighborhood of similar split-level homes. The listing said the host lived off-site. It also mentioned that the basement was locked and unavailable, described as storage for personal items. That did not bother us. We planned to be there 2 nights and spend most of the time out. We arrived in the late afternoon. The street was lined with mature trees and identical mailboxes. The house sat slightly lower than the road, with a short driveway and a single-car garage. Inside, everything looked normal. The main level had a living room, kitchen, and dining area. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The basement door was at the bottom of a short stairway near the kitchen. It was solid wood with a keypad lock installed where a normal handle would be. The door frame showed scratches from previous hardware. The place felt lived in, not staged. There were family photos turned face down on a shelf. Shoes in the closet that were not our size. A coat on a hook that smelled faintly of cologne. We assumed the host stored things here between guests. That seemed common enough. The first night passed without anything worth noting. We cooked, watched television, and went to sleep around midnight. The house made normal sounds. Pipes ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Wind moved through the trees outside. Nothing felt wrong. The second day was long. We left early and came back late. By the time we returned, it was close to 11. We were tired and quiet, moving through the house with low lights on. The neighborhood outside was still. No cars passed. No voices carried from nearby homes. It was close to 1 in the morning when we noticed the first sound. A dull thump beneath the living room floor. It was slow and heavy, spaced far enough apart that it felt intentional. At first, it registered as part of the house settling. Then it came again, closer this time, followed by a faint scrape. We paused and listened. The sound stopped. We stood there longer than necessary, waiting for it to repeat. When it did not, we moved on. Later, After we went upstairs, the sound returned. This time it came from directly below the bedroom. It was not loud. It was steady. The rhythm matched footsteps, slow ones, pacing back and forth. The floor did not creak. The sound came through the structure itself, carried upward through beams. We tried to explain it away. Old houses carried noise in strange ways. Heating systems knocked. Water lines shifted. Still, the pacing did not fit that pattern. It stopped when we held still. It resumed when we shifted position. We moved to the other bedroom. Within minutes, the sound followed. It relocated beneath us, adjusted to our position. That was when the unease set in fully. Not fear yet, but a tightening awareness that something was wrong. We checked the thermostat. The system was off. The pipes were quiet. The house itself felt still, like it was holding its breath. Around 3 in the morning, the pacing stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had. We lay awake, listening for any sign of movement. At 3:18 a.m., the basement door unlocked. The sound was unmistakable. A short electronic chirp, followed by the soft click of a disengaging bolt, came from below, from the stairway near the kitchen. We both heard it. There was no mistaking it for anything else. We did not move at first. We waited for footsteps on the stairs. None came. The house stayed silent. After several minutes, we gathered enough nerve to leave the bedroom. The hallway light stayed off. We moved slowly, keeping our steps light. From the top of the stairs, we could see the basement door standing slightly open. A thin line of darkness cut through the light from the kitchen. The air near the stairway felt cooler. There was a faint smell rising from below, stale and human. Not rot, not garbage, just the smell of someone spending too much time in a confined space. We stood there longer than we should have. Eventually, we turned on the kitchen light and descended the stairs. The basement was unfinished. Concrete floor, exposed beams. A single bulb hung from a cord near the center of the space. It was already on. Near the far wall, there was a mattress on the floor. No frame, no sheets, just a bare mattress with an indentation that had not yet lifted. It was still warm. The warmth was undeniable. It radiated upward when we held our hands above it. Next to the mattress was a small fan, plugged into an extension cord that ran into the wall. The outlet had been modified, the cover removed to allow the cord to sit flush. On the floor nearby were food wrappers, granola bars, bread packaging, plastic containers. They were soft, recently handled, not brittle or dried. There were other signs too. Pair of shoes by the wall, folded hoodie, a phone charger plugged into a second extension cord. The cords ran along the base of the wall, hidden as much as possible. This was not old storage. This was not abandoned. Someone had been here recently, or they were here now. We backed away from the mattress and scanned the corners of the basement. There was no one visible, no door leading outside, no windows at ground level. The only exit was the stairway behind us. We returned upstairs and locked ourselves in the bedroom. Sleep was impossible after that. We stayed awake until morning, listening for any sound below. Nothing moved. At first light, we packed quickly. Every creak made us tense. We did not open the basement door again. We left as soon as the car was loaded. We contacted the host through the app once we were off the property. We described what we found in neutral terms, sticking to facts. The response came hours later. The host claimed the basement had been empty for months. The mattress was described as old storage. The food was dismissed as forgotten trash. The lock unlocking itself was blamed on a malfunction. While we were still packing, a locksmith arrived. We watched from the front window as the basement lock was removed and replaced. The work took less than an hour. The new lock looked heavier, newer, more secure. The old keypad was taken away. No explanation was offered for the warm mattress. No reason given for the powered fan or the modified outlet. The host did not come to the house. We left and checked into a motel despite the cost. Once there, we reviewed the listing again. The photos still showed the same rooms. The basement was still mentioned as locked storage. Nothing had changed yet. A week later, the listing was gone. We reported everything through the platform. We attached photos taken discreetly in the basement. The report was acknowledged, then closed. No follow-up came. Over time, the details settled into a clear picture. The host lived closer than claimed, or someone connected to him did. The basement was not storage. It was a living space hidden in plain sight. The pacing beneath us was not pipes or heat. It was someone adjusting their position based on where we stood, careful not to reveal themselves. The lock unlocking at night was not a glitch. It was access being taken. The most disturbing part was not the presence of another person in the house. It was the control, the awareness, the fact that someone knew where we were at all times and chose to stay hidden. We stopped using short-term rentals after that. Hotels cost more, but walls are thicker and staff are present. When I think back on that house now, I picture the basement light already on when the door opened. I think about the warmth that had not yet faded. I think about how close we were to someone who had every advantage of familiarity and concealment. Nothing happened to us beyond fear and lost sleep. That does not make it small. It makes it real.